They agreed to a marriage with no love, no warmth, and no future. And by the first quiet morning, something inside that silence had already begun to break. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from. And if you believe love can grow where it was never planted, stay with me. Elias Whitaker signed the paper. Without hesitation, his name steady as iron. Clara Bennett followed, her hand lighter, but no less certain. There were no vows spoken, no rings exchanged, just the scratch of ink on paper, and the wind pressing against the windows of a house that didn't yet belong to either of them. Outside, the land stretched for miles, dry, endless, the kind of place where people came not to live, but to endure. Elias needed someone to keep the house standing, meals cooked, floors swept, a presence that made the silence less heavy. Clara needed a place where no one asked questions, where her past could stay buried under dust and distance. They made their rules before the sun went down. No shared room, no questions about where they came from, no expectations beyond survival. That night, Elias took the smaller bedroom at the back of the house. Clara chose the one near the front where the early light would come in through thin curtains. Neither of them slept much. The walls were thin enough to hear movement, not words, just the quiet shift of someone else existing on the other side. Morning came, cold pale light spilling across the wooden floor. Elias woke before dawn, out of habit, pulled on his boots, stepped outside where the air smelled like dry earth and old wood. When he came back in, the kitchen was already warm. Clara stood at the stove, her back to him, hair loosely tied, sleeves rolled just enough to keep them clean. She didn't turn when he entered, didn't greet him, didn't need to. A plate was already set on the table, eggs, bread, black coffee. He sat down, ate in silence. The only sound was the soft clink of fork against ceramic and the slow ticking of a clock neither of them had wound after a while. He noticed something strange. There was only one plate. Clara stood by the window holding a cup, but she never drank from it, just stared out across the empty land as if waiting for something that wasn't coming. Elias didn't ask, that was the rule, but as the morning light grew stronger and the silence settled deeper into the walls, he realized something he hadn't expected. This house wasn't empty anymore, and somehow that made it feel heavier than before. The second morning arrived quieter than the first, but somehow heavier, like the house had learned their silence and decided to keep it. Elias Whitaker noticed the small things first, the way the coffee was already poured before he stepped inside, the way the chair across from him was always pulled out just enough to suggest presence, but never used. Clara Bennett moved through the kitchen like she had measured every step in advance, nothing wasted, nothing accidental. She folded a cloth twice before setting it down, aligned the plates with a precision that felt less like habit and more like control. He washed without meaning to, not staring, just noticing the way a man notices the weather when it changes without warning. She still did not eat with him, not even a bite, not even a sip from the cup she held each morning like a prop meant to convince the world she belonged there. But her hands told a different story, fingers wrapped too tight, knuckles pale, as if holding on to something invisible. Elias had lived alone long enough to understand absence and what it looked like when someone refused to take up space, and Clara was doing exactly that. She was living inside the house without ever stepping into it. Later that day, he found the first sign that something had shifted. It was not loud, not obvious, just a piece of cloth resting on the back of his chair, a wool scarf, dark gray, worn at the edges, but clean. He had not left it there, and it was not as Clara was outside at the well, her sleeves rolled higher than before, pulling water like she had done it all her life. He stood there longer than he should have, looking at that scarf like it carried a question he had not agreed to answer. When she came back and she did not look at the chair, did not mention it, did not even slow her step as she passed him. She simply moved on like nothing had changed, but something had. The wind picked up that afternoon, rattling the loose boards along the side of the house, dust slipping through the cracks in thin lines that caught the light. Elias fixed what needed fixing, checked the fence line, counted the cattle, all the things a man did to keep control over a life that could easily fall apart. But his mind kept drifting back to the kitchen, to the empty chair, to the scarf that did not belong to him. By evening, the air had turned colder than expected, the kind of cold that settled into your bones before you realized it. Elias returned inside, boots heavy against the wooden floor, and there it was again, the plate already set, the food already warm, and beside it the scarf still waiting. He picked it up this time, felt the roughness of the fabric, the faint warmth still caught inside it, as if it had been held not long ago. He did not ask why he did not call her name. He simply draped it over the back of his own chair and sat down. Clara stood by the window again, same place, same Stillness, but this time when the wind pressed harder against the glass, she turned slightly, just enough for him to see her face for a brief second. And in that moment Elias understood something. He had not expected. This was not distance born from indifference. This was distance built on purpose. And whatever had built it was still standing between them. By the third morning, the house no longer felt unfamiliar. It felt arranged, like every object had quietly chosen a place and refused to move. Elias Whitaker woke before the light again, but this time he did not step outside right away. He stayed seated on the edge of his bed, listening to the faint sounds beyond the wall. Not movement, not work, just a soft rhythm, like someone pacing slowly, as if counting steps in their head. When he finally entered the kitchen, Clara Bennett was not at the stove. The fire was already lit, the kettle beginning to hum, but she stood near the table, her hands resting on the wood, her eyes lowered, not empty, not distant, just fixed on something inside her own thoughts. The plate was there as always, but today there was a second one set across from his, untouched, but placed with the same care. He stopped just inside the doorway, not because he meant to hesitate, but because something about that second plate felt louder than any words they had not spoken. Clara noticed him, then only by the shift in light behind her. She did not turn immediately. Instead, she reached for the cloth beside the plate, adjusted it slightly, like she was correcting something no one else could see. Then finally, she faced him. Her expression did not ask anything, did not offer anything, but it held a kind of quiet steadiness that had not been there before. Elias moved to his chair slowly, the floorboards creaking under his boots, a sound that seemed too sharp for the room. He sat down, looked at the food, then at the empty place across from him. Clara remained standing for a moment longer, then, without a word, she pulled out the chair opposite and sat. The motion was simple, but it broke something neither of them had named. The silence that followed was different, no longer a wall, but something thinner, something that could be crossed if either of them chose to. Elias picked up his fork, the metal cool in his hand. He took a bite, but his attention was not on the food, it was on the sound of another fork lifting from the other side of the table. Clara ate slowly, carefully, like she was learning the motion again. After a long time of not needing it, they did not look at each other, not directly, but the space between them had changed. It was no longer empty, it held something fragile, something unspoken. The wind outside had settled the boards along the walls, no longer rattled, and the light coming through the window stretched across the table, touching both plates at once. While Clara set her fork down, her hands resting lightly on either side of the plate, not gripping, not holding, just there. Elias noticed the way her shoulders lowered slightly, as if a weight had shifted, not gone, but moved enough to let her breathe. He wanted to ask something, not about her past, not about why she had come here, but something smaller, something present, but the words did not come, and maybe they were not needed, because in that quiet morning, with two plates no longer untouched and a chair no longer empty, something had already begun to take shape, and neither of them knew yet what it would become. That morning should have changed everything, but instead it left something unfinished, hanging in the air like a word never spoken. Elias Whitaker stepped outside after breakfast, the sun barely above the horizon, casting long shadows across the dry land. But his mind stayed behind at the table, where for the first time two plates had not been empty. The work needed doing, fence posts leaning, a section of wire loose, cattle drifting too close to the far boundary. He handled each task with the same steady precision. He always had measuring distance and feet checking tension in his hands, but something in his rhythm was off, not wrong, just distracted. He found himself pausing more than usual, looking back toward the house, as if expecting to see something different, though nothing ever moved out there except wind and dust inside. Clara Bennett moved through the room slower than before, not uncertain, just deliberate, like she was learning the shape of the space in a new way. She wiped the table twice, though it was already clean, adjusted the curtain near the window to let in more light, then less, then back again, as if testing how much of the outside world should be allowed in. The second plate remained on the table longer than it should have, untouched now, but not forgotten. When she finally picked it up, her hands lingered on it for a moment longer than necessary, her fingers tracing the edge where the light had rested earlier, as if trying to hold on to something that had already passed. By midday, the air had warmed, the kind of dry heat that settled into the wood and made the house creak softly. Clara stepped outside for the first time since morning, standing on the porch, her eyes narrowing slightly against the brightness. Elias was near the far fence, maybe 60 yards out, his figure small against the open land, but steady. She watched him for a long moment, not calling out, not signaling, just observing the way he moved, the way he stopped to adjust a post, then stepped back to check his work as if distance was part of the task. Something about that distance felt familiar, not physical, but chosen. She turned back inside before he could notice, before anything needed to be explained. When Elias returned later, dust clinging to his boots, the house felt different again, not louder, not warmer, just aware. The table was cleared, the plates washed, and stacked, the scarf still resting on the back of his chair like a quiet reminder of something neither of them had addressed. Clara stood near the window as always, but this time she was not still. Her fingers moved slowly along the edge of the frame, tracing the worn wood, as if counting its imperfections. He paused just inside the doorway again, not because he was unsure, but because something in the room asked for it. The silence between them had shifted once more, no longer heavy, no longer empty, but not yet easy either. It was something in between, something waiting. Clara turned slightly, not fully, just enough for him to see the side of her face, the light catching in her eyes, not distant anymore, not closed, just guarded in a different way, as if whatever wall she had built was no longer meant to keep everything out, but to decide what could come in. Elias took a step forward, then stopped, not out of fear, not out of habit, but because for the first time he understood that whatever was changing between them was not his to force and not hers to deny. It was something that would either find its way through the quiet or remain there unfinished. And in that moment, neither of them moved, neither of them spoke, but both of them knew the distance they had agreed to was no longer holding the way it once had. The fifth morning came with no wind at all, and somehow that made everything louder. Elias Whitaker noticed at the moment. He opened his eyes, the stillness pressing against the walls like the world itself was holding its breath. He sat up slowly, boots resting on the floorboards, but he did not stand right away, because there it was again, that faint sound from beyond the wall, not pacing this time, not movement, just a soft, uneven breath, as if someone had not slept as much as they needed. When he stepped into the kitchen, Clara Bennett was already there, but something was different, not in what she did, but in how she held herself. The fire burned low, not yet tended, the kettle untouched, the table set, but not with the same precision as before. One fork slightly out of line, one cup placed closer to the edge than usual. Small things, but enough for a man like Elias to notice. Clara stood near the sink, her hands resting on the wood, but not moving, her shoulders drawn in slightly, like she was carrying something that had not been there the day before. He did not speak, and neither did she, but the silence now felt thinner, almost fragile, like it could break under the weight of a single word. He moved to the table, sat down, and waited, not for food, not for routine, but for something he could not name. Clara turned after a moment, her eyes meeting his, not directly, but close enough that it was no longer avoidance. She stepped forward, placed the last piece of bread on the plate, then hesitated just for a second before taking the chair across from him again. They ate slowly, neither rushing, neither pretending. This was still the same as before, but the quiet carried something else now, not distance, not restraint, something closer to uncertainty, like both of them were standing at the edge of something they had not agreed to approach. Halfway through the meal, Clara set her fork down, her fingers lingering on it like she was deciding whether to continue or stop entirely. Elias noticed the way her gaze drifted toward the window, then back to the table, then finally toward him. She opened her mouth slightly as if to speak, but the words did not come in. After a moment, she looked away again, but this time not with distance, with hesitation. Elias placed his fork down as well, not mirroring her, not responding, just choosing stillness in a different way. The clock on the wall ticked once, twice, the sound louder than it had ever been before. Then Clara reached forward, not across the table, not toward him, but toward the center, where a small crack ran through the wood, a line he had never bothered to fix. Her fingers traced it slowly, following its path as if it led somewhere beyond the surface. Elias watched that small movement and understood something that had been building quietly since the first morning. This was not about rules anymore, not about distance or agreement. It was about something neither of them had planned and neither of them knew how to name. Clara finally spoke, her voice low, steady, but unfamiliar, like it had not been used in a long time. I did not think it would feel like this. She did not explain what this meant, and she did not need to, because Elias felt it too, not in words, not in thought, but in the way the room held them both, without pushing them apart. He did not answer right away, because whatever came next would not fit inside the rules they had made, and for the first time he realized those rules were no longer strong enough to hold what was beginning to take shape between them. The words stayed between them long after Clara Bennett spoke them, not loud, not demanding, just present, like something that had finally stepped into the room and refused to leave. Elias Whitaker did not answer right away because he knew whatever he said next would change the shape of things in a way that could not be undone. He leaned back slightly in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. His eyes not on her, but on the table, on that thin crack her fingers had traced, as if it held more truth than either of them had spoken. The silence stretched, but it no longer felt empty. It felt full, like a space waiting to be crossed. Clara did not look away this time. She kept her gaze steady, not challenging, not pleading, just there. And that alone was different from every moment before. Elias had spent years understanding distance, how to keep it, how to live inside it without asking for more. But this was not distance anymore. This was something closer to choice. He reached for the cup in front of him, lifted it slowly, but did not drink, just held it like he needed something to anchor his hands. Clara's voice came again, softer this time, but clearer. I thought it would stay simple. She paused, not searching for words, just letting them come when they were ready. I thought if we did not expect anything, then nothing could change. Elias let out a slow breath, not heavy, not tired, just measured. He set the cup down carefully, the sound small, but certain. Nothing stays the same out here, he said, his voice steady, the kind that did not push or pull, just existed. The land changes, the weather changes. He stopped for a moment, not because he did not know what to say, but because he did, and he was deciding whether to say it. People do too. Clara lowered her eyes briefly, not in retreat, but in thought, her fingers resting flat on the table, now no longer tracing, no longer searching, just still. And what if I did not want it to? She asked. The question did not carry fear. It carried something else, something quieter, something closer to honesty. Elias looked at her then fully for the first time, not a glance, not a passing notice, but a direct, steady look that did not turn away. You already did, he said, not harsh, not gentle, just true. The room held that answer like it had been waiting for it. Clara did not respond right away, her shoulders shifting slightly, as if something inside her had been set down or picked up. He could not tell which. Outside, the light had changed, the sun higher now, casting shorter shadows across the floor. The day moving forward, whether they followed or not. Clara stood slowly, not abrupt, not hesitant, just a decision unfolding in motion. She gathered the plates one by one, her movements familiar again, but not distant. As she passed behind him, she paused just for a second, not touching, not speaking, just close enough that he could feel the presence of her in a way he had not allowed himself to notice before. Then she moved on to the sink, water running softly against ceramic. Elias remained seated for a moment longer, his hands resting on the table, his eyes still on that thin crack. But he was not seeing it anymore. He was seeing something else, something less certain, but more real than the rules they had written days ago. And for the first time since she had arrived, he did not feel the need to step outside right away, because whatever was changing was no longer out there in the open land. It was here, inside these walls, in the quiet space between two people who had agreed to feel nothing and were beginning to understand. That agreement was no longer holding. The rest of the day did not return to what it had been before, and that was the first thing Elias Whitaker noticed, not in the work, not in the land, but in the way time moved slower inside the house, as if something had shifted its weight and refused to settle back. Clara Bennett did not speak again after the morning, but she did not retreat either. She remained present in a way that could not be ignored, not standing at a distance, not disappearing into quiet tasks, but moving through the space, as if she had finally decided she was allowed to be seen. Elias stepped outside, eventually, not out of habit this time, but because he needed air, the kind that stretched wide and asked nothing from him. The sky was clear, no clouds, no wind, just open blue and the long, dry stretch of land that had never once questioned his silence. He checked the far fence again, walked the length of it, slow, steady, boots pressing into dust, each step measured in feet, like it always had been. But his thoughts did not follow the same path. They circled back to the kitchen, to the way Clara had not looked away, to the way her voice had carried something he could not ignore. He had lived years without needing to understand another person, without needing to answer anything that was not asked directly. But now there was a question that had not been spoken fully, and it was waiting for him to recognize it. By the time he returned, the sun had begun to lower the light, turning softer, stretching shadows across the porch. Clara was sitting outside, not standing, not working, just sitting on the edge of the wooden step, her hands resting loosely in her lap, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the land met the sky. He slowed as he approached, not because he was unsure, but because the sight of her there felt different from anything before. She had never taken space like that, never allowed herself to simply exist in the open. He stopped a few feet away, not close, not distant, just enough to share the same piece of ground, without crossing into something neither of them had defined. Clara did not turn right away. She seemed to sense him there the way a person feels the shift of light without needing to see it. After a moment, she spoke, her voice calm, but not detached. I used to sit like this before. She did not explain where or when, and Elias did not ask. He stepped closer, just one step, and leaned slightly against the porch post, the wood rough against his shoulder, grounding him in something familiar. What made you stop? He asked. The question came out simple, not heavy, not searching, just there. Clara took a breath, slow, steady, her eyes still on the horizon. I thought if I stayed still long enough, nothing would catch up to me. She paused, her fingers tightening slightly, then relaxing again. But it always does. Elias nodded once, not because he fully understood, but because he understood enough. The land does not wait, he said quietly. Neither do people. Clara turned then, finally, meeting his eyes fully, not guarded, not distant, just open in a way that made the space between them feel smaller. And what if I do not know how to stop running? She asked. Elias did not answer right away, because this was not something that could be fixed or solved. It was something that had to be met where it stood. He pushed himself off the post, took another step forward, not enough to touch, not enough to break anything, just enough to stand beside her, looking out at the same horizon. Then you do not, he said after a moment, you just stopped choosing to run alone. The words settled between them, not loud, not final, just present. Clara looked back toward the horizon again, but this time her shoulders lowered slightly, her breath steadier than before, and for the first time since she had arrived, she did not look like she was waiting for something to end. She looked like she was beginning to consider what it meant to stay. That evening did not end the way most evenings do out on that kind of land. There was no clear line between day and night, just a slow fading of light that made everything softer and harder to read at the same time. Elias Whitaker remained on the porch longer than he usually would, not speaking, not moving much, just standing beside Clara Bennett as the horizon dimmed into shades of gray and blue. The air cooled, gradually brushing against their sleeves, carrying the faint scent of dry grass and distant earth. Clara did not shift away. She did not return inside either. She stayed where she was, her presence no longer careful or hidden, but not fully settled, yet something in between, like a step paused mid-motion. After a while, she drew her knees slightly closer to herself, not closed off, just grounded, and rested her hands there, her fingers no longer restless. Elias noticed that small change, the way her hands had stopped searching for something to hold on to, and simply remained still, as if they had found enough. He did not look at her directly, but he was aware of her in a way that felt new, not intrusive, not distant, just shared the silence between them, no longer asked questions. It allowed space. The first star appeared faint above the horizon, a small point of light that might have been missed on any other night. Clara tilted her head, slightly noticing it too. Her voice came softer than before, but clearer, like it had found its place. I used to count them, she said. Elias followed her gaze, not because he needed to see the star, but because she had pointed it out. I would sit for hours and count until I forgot why I started. He let that settle for a moment, then asked quietly, did it work? She gave a small breath that was almost a laugh, but not quite. For a while, she said, then something always reminded me. He nodded once, the kind of understanding that does not require explanation. The night grew deeper, more stars appearing one by one, filling the sky with a quiet pattern that did not need to be named. Clara shifted slightly, then not away from him, but closer by just a few inches, not enough to touch, not enough to break the space, just enough to change it. Elias felt that movement not as a surprise, but as something expected, like a door that had been opening slowly, now moving just a little further. He did not step back, he did not move forward, he simply stayed where he was, letting the distance adjust on its own. After a long silence, Clara spoke again, not looking at him. Do you ever wish it had been different? Elias considered the question carefully, not because it was difficult, but because it was honest out here. He said slowly, things are what they are. Clara turned her head slightly, her eyes searching his face, not for an answer, but for something behind it. And if they were not, she asked. Elias met her gaze, then steady and calm, then they would not have brought you here. The words were simple, but they carried something deeper than explanation. Clara held his gaze for a moment longer, then looked back at the sky, her shoulders easing just a little more, as if something inside her had shifted into place, not fully settled, but no longer resisting. The night wrapped around them, quiet and steady, and for the first time since the agreement that had brought them together, the space between them no longer felt like something to protect. It felt like something slowly becoming shared. The night passed without either of them saying anything more, but something had already been spoken in the silence. and it did not fade with the dark. Elias Whitaker woke later than usual the next morning, not by much, just enough to notice the difference. The light already touching the edges of the room. When he opened his eyes, he sat there for a moment longer than he normally would, listening not for movement, but for the absence of it. The house quieter than before, but not empty. He stepped into the kitchen and paused, not out of habit this time, but because the space in front of him had changed again. The table was set, as always, 2 plates, 2 cups, but this time both had been used, one still holding the faint warmth of coffee, the other marked by the small crumbs left behind. Clara Bennett stood by the stove, her back to him, but not distant, not closed off, just present in a way that did not try to disappear. She turned slightly when she heard him, her expression calm, not guarded, not hesitant, just aware. Morning. She said the words, simple, but carrying a weight that had not been there before. Elias nodded once, stepping forward, taking his place at the table. Without needing to be shown, he noticed the small details again, the way the second chair was no longer pulled halfway out, but fully set in place. The way her cup sat closer to his than before, not touching, but no longer apart. Clara moved to the table after a moment, not waiting, not asking, just sitting across from him. Like it had always been that way. They ate quietly, but the silence now felt different, not something to maintain, but something that existed on its own, without effort. Elias set his fork down after a few bites, his eyes lifting, not searching, just meeting hers for a moment. Clara did not look away. What are you doing today? He asked the question, simple, but new. Clara seemed to take a moment, not because she did not understand, but because she was not used to answering. I thought I might clean out the back room, she said slowly. The one you do not use? Elias nodded once. That room had been closed for years, not locked, just untouched. I can help, he said. The words came without weight, without obligation, just offered. Clara studied him for a brief second, not suspicious, not surprised, just measuring something inside herself. Then she gave a small nod. All right. The decision settled between them quietly, but it carried something more than agreement. It carried intention. Later that morning, they stood in the doorway of the back room, dust hanging in the air, thin and golden in the light that slipped through a narrow window. The room smelled like old wood and time, things left where they had been and never moved. Clara stepped in first, not hesitant, not careful, just steady. Elias followed a step behind, watching the way she looked around, not with curiosity, but with recognition, as if she understood what it meant to leave something untouched for too long. She moved toward a small table near the wall, brushing her fingers across its surface, leaving a clean line through the dust. You kept this closed, she said, not as a question. Elias nodded. There was no need for it. Before Clara glanced back at him, then at the room again. Maybe there is now, she said softly. Elias did not answer right away, because the truth of that was not something he had expected, but standing there in that space that had been empty for so long, he could feel it, something opening, something shifting, not just in the room, but between them. And for the first time, he did not think about closing the door again. The dust did not settle right away. It lingered in the air, thin and slow, as Clara Bennett moved further into the back room, her steps careful but not hesitant, like she understood that disturbing what had been left untouched would change more than just the space. Elias Whitaker remained near the doorway for a moment longer, watching the way the light caught in the air around her, the way each movement revealed something that had been hidden, not by intention, but by time. Clara reached the small table and began clearing it with steady hands, not rushing, not pausing, just moving with purpose, as if the act itself mattered more than the result. Elias stepped in, then the floor creaking under his weight, a sound that seemed louder in a room that had forgotten what footsteps felt like. He moved to the far wall, where a shelf leaned slightly forward, the wood worn, but still holding. He adjusted it, without thinking, his hands working through memory more than thought, but his attention stayed on her, on the way she handled each object, not as something old or forgotten, but as something that still carried meaning. She picked up a folded cloth, brushing off the dust gently before setting it aside, then a small wooden box, its surface marked by years of use. She paused there, just for a moment, her fingers resting on the lid, not opening it, not asking, just acknowledging it was there. Elias noticed that pause, the way her hand lingered, as if she understood that some things were not meant to be opened all at once. He turned back to his work, giving her the space, without needing to say it. The room slowly changed shape, not in structure, but in presence. The air clearing, the light settling more evenly across the floor. Clara moved toward the window, pushing it open slightly, the wood resisting at first before giving way. With a soft sound, fresh air slipped in, carrying the scent of dry land and something faintly warm the outside meeting the inside in a way that had not happened for years. Elias stopped for a moment, feeling that shift not just in the room, but in himself, something opening that had been closed without him noticing. Clara turned back from the window, her eyes scanning the room again, not searching this time, but seeing it feels different, she said, her voice quiet but certain. Elias nodded. Once it does not take much, he replied, just time and someone willing to change it. Clara looked at him, then not questioning, not guarded, just steady. And you were not. Elias met her gaze, not defensive, not distant, just honest. I did not think it needed changing. The words stayed there, simple, but carrying more than they said. Clara stepped closer, not enough to close the space, but enough to stand within it. Maybe it did, she said, not as a challenge, not as a correction, just as something that had become clear. Elias did not answer right away because the truth of that was still settling in his mind. The idea that something he had left untouched was not finished, but waiting. He looked around the room again. The dust now mostly cleared, the light stronger, the space no longer closed off, but open in a quiet way that did not demand attention, but held it. And for the first time he understood that this was not just about a room or a task, it was about what happened when something long ignored was finally seen. Clara moved past him toward the doorway, pausing briefly as she reached it, not turning back, not stopping, just allowing the moment to exist before stepping out into the hall. Elias remained where he was for a few seconds longer, his hand resting against the shelf. He had fixed his eyes on the space that no longer felt the same, and when he finally followed her out, he did not look back at the room, because he already knew it would not be closed again. The rest of the house felt different after that. Room was open, not louder, not brighter, just aware. Like every corner had begun to remember it was meant to be lived in. Elias Whitaker stepped into the main room and paused without realizing he had done it, his hand resting briefly on the back of the chair, where the gray scarf still hung. It had not moved since the day it first appeared, but now it no longer felt like something out of place. It felt like something that belonged. Clara Bennett was near the window again, but not standing still this time. She was adjusting the curtain, letting in more light than before, the fabric catching the sun and softening it across the wooden floor. When she turned and saw him there, she did not step away. She did not lower her gaze. She simply held his presence like it was expected, not something to prepare for or avoid. Elias moved further into the room, slow, steady, his boots quieter than usual against the floor, as if even the house had decided not to interrupt whatever this was becoming. Clara glanced toward the table, then back at him. We should use that room, she said, not as a suggestion, but not quite a decision either. Elias followed her glance, the idea settling into place without resistance. It was no longer a question of whether it would change. It already had. He nodded. Once it is yours to use. Clara tilted her head slightly at that, not confused, but thoughtful. She corrected gently. The word landed differently than anything else she had said, not because of how it sounded, but because of what it allowed. Elias did not respond right away because that word carried weight, not heavy, but real, something that did not fit into the agreement they had made at the beginning. He looked around the house. Again, the table, the chair, the scarf, the light shifting through the window, all of it connected now in a way it had not been before, and he understood that whatever line they had drawn between them was no longer where it had been. Clara moved toward the table, her fingers brushing against the surface where the thin crack still ran through the wood. She traced it once more, but this time her hand did not stop at the edge. It continued across, as if the line itself had lost its meaning. Elias watched that small movement and felt something settle inside him, not sudden, not overwhelming, just certain. You can move your things in there, he said. After a moment, Clara looked up at him, her expression steady, but softer than before. I do not have much, she replied. Elias gave a slight nod. That is enough. The words were simple, but they carried something deeper than reassurance. They carried acceptance, not of what she had brought, but of what she had chosen to stay. For Clara held his gaze for a moment longer, then looked down again, her hand resting flat against the table, no longer tracing, no longer searching, just still. The quiet between them returned, but it was not the same quiet as before. It did not separate. It held. The afternoon light stretched across the room, touching both of them in the same space, without dividing it. Clara stepped away from the table, then not retreating, not leaving, just moving with purpose toward the hallway leading to the back room. She paused at the entrance, just for a second, then continued inside. Without looking back, Elias remained where he was for a moment longer, his hand still resting on the back of the chair, his fingers brushing lightly against the fabric of the scarf. Then he let it go and followed, not because he had to, not because he was asked, but because for the first time since she arrived, he understood that whatever they had agreed to at the beginning was no longer the thing holding them there. Clara Bennett stepped into the back room, as if it had always been waiting for her, not in ownership, not in claim, but in quiet understanding that some spaces only open when someone is ready to stand inside them. Elias Whitaker followed a moment later, stopping just inside the doorway again, but this time not as an outsider, not as someone looking in, but as someone learning how to remain. The room no longer held the weight it once did, the air clearer, the lights steady across the floorboards that had not seen it in years. Clara moved to the window, first adjusting it slightly, letting more of the outside and the breeze soft, but present, lifting a corner of the cloth she had set aside earlier. It is strange, she said, her voice low but certain, how something can feel closed for so long, and then not at all. Elias leaned lightly against the wall, not distant, not close, just there. It was not closed, he replied, just waiting. Clara turned her head slightly, considering that, not disagreeing, just letting it settle. Maybe, she said, or maybe I was. She stepped toward the small wooden box she had touched before, her fingers resting on the lid again, but this time she did not pull away. She opened it slowly, not with hesitation, but with care. Inside were a few simple things: a folded piece of fabric, a small silver button, a letter worn at the edges. Clara did not pick them up right away. She simply looked, as if understanding that what mattered was not what they were, but that they had been kept. Elias did not move closer. He did not need to see to understand that whatever was inside that box belonged to a time he had not spoken about, and had not needed to until now. Clara reached in, finally lifting the letter carefully, the paper soft from age. She did not open it. Instead, she held it for a moment, then looked back at him. You kept this for a reason, she said. Elias met her gaze, steady and quiet. I did. Clara waited, not asking him to explain, not pressing him to say more, just holding the space where he could if he chose to. It was not something he had planned to speak about, not something he had needed to share, but standing there with the room no longer closed, and the silence no longer protective, he understood that some things were not meant to stay untouched forever. It was from before, he said slowly, not looking at the box now, but at her. A time I thought was finished. Clara nodded once, not because she understood the details, but because she understood the meaning of that. Elias pushed himself off the wall, stepping forward just enough to stand beside the table, not reaching for the letter, not taking it from her, just standing there within the same space. It was easier not to open that door, he continued, easier to leave it, as it was. Clara looked down at the letter again, then back at him, and now she asked. Elias did not answer immediately, because the answer was not something he could give in words, not fully. He looked around the room, the light, the air, the space that had changed because someone had chosen to step into it. Then he looked at her, because now it is not just mine. Clara held that answer quietly, then placed the letter back into the box, not closing it, not hiding it, just leaving it there, open within reach. The moment settled between them, not loud, not final, just clear, and for the first time the past did not feel like something that stood between them. It felt like something that had finally been allowed to exist alongside what was beginning to grow. The room remained open long after neither of them touched the box again, and that was how Elias Whitaker understood something had truly changed, not in what was said, but in what was no longer hidden. Clara Bennett stepped away from the table, slowly, her hand brushing once more against the edge, not to close it, not to move it, just to acknowledge it was there, and would remain there. Elias stayed beside the wall for a moment longer, his gaze moving across the space that had once been sealed away, and now held light, dust-gone air, steady, something quiet but undeniable settling into place. By the time they stepped back into the main room, the day had begun to fade, the light stretching low across the floor, catching the grain of the wood and the thin crack in the table that no longer felt like a break, but part of the shape. Clara moved to the window, adjusting the curtain, without thinking, her hands familiar now with the way the light should fall. Elias walked to the chair where the gray scarf still rested. He picked it up, this time not examining it, not questioning it, just folding it once and placing it gently on the table beside her cup. Clara noticed the movement, her eyes following the small gesture, then lifting to meet his, not searching, not uncertain, just steady. It does not feel the same, she said quietly. Elias gave a slight nod. It is not. Clara looked around the room, the table, the chair, the open hallway leading to the back room, all of it connected now in a way it had not been before, and we did not plan it, she added. Elias allowed a faint breath of something almost like a smile. Not everything needs planning, he replied, the words settled easily, not as a lesson, not as an answer, just as something true the evening came in slowly, the sky outside dimming into that soft gray that held both day and night. At once Clara moved to the table, setting 2 plates again, but this time without pause, without hesitation, the motion simple, natural, like it had always belonged there. Elias took his place across from her, not because it was expected, but because it felt right. They ate in quiet, but it was no longer a silence that separated them. It was one that held them both, without effort. After the meal, Clara did not stand right away. She remained seated, her hands resting lightly on the table, her gaze not drifting, not distant, just present. Elias stayed as well, neither of them rushing to move on to the next task. For the next moment, the clock ticked softly in the background, the sound no longer sharp, no longer marking distance, but simply part of the room. Clara finally spoke, her voice calm and certain. "I think I can stay." The words were not asked, not offered as a question, they were a choice. Elias looked at her, not surprised, not uncertain, just understanding. "Then stay," he said simply. No conditions, no rules, no distance placed between them, just the truth of it. Clara held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once, a small movement, but steady. The night settled fully outside, the stars beginning to appear one by one, just as they had before. But this time, neither of them needed to count them. The house no longer felt like a place to pass through or endure. It felt lived in, not because of what had changed, but because of what had been allowed to remain. And somewhere in that quiet space between them, where nothing had been promised and nothing had been forced, something had taken root, not loud, not sudden, just certain. Out here, it did not arrive with words. It arrived when no one was looking, and stayed because no one asked it to leave.